Welcome to the debate. Today we're opening up the chest cavity of nutritional science to look at, frankly, the single most controversial topic on the dinner table.
Yeah, the one that starts arguments at every family holiday.
Exactly. For over 60 years now, public health policy has been built on one central pillar, which is the diet-heart hypothesis. The logic is ingrained in almost every one of us since grade school. It goes like this. Saturated fats, the kind found in steak, butter, and cheese, well, they raise your cholesterol, clog your arteries, and eventually cause a heart attack. It is the very reason we have low-fat yogurt, egg white omelets, and the dietary guidelines that shape school lunches and hospital trays worldwide.
Right, and yet, despite 6 decades of that messaging being pounded into us, heart disease remains the #1 killer globally. And recently, that bedrock of science has developed some massive cracks. We are seeing a wave of rigorous, revisionist science that is asking a fairly terrifying question. What if we got it wrong? What if natural fats aren't the enemy? And perhaps most importantly, what if the very guidelines meant to save us have actually made us sicker?
And that is the tension we are exploring today. Does consuming saturated fat actually increase your risk of dying? The core of our discussion right here. I am here to argue that the medical consensus exists for a very good reason. The established view, supported by the American Heart Association, the World Health Organization, and the Cochrane Library, is that reducing saturated fat lowers cardiovascular events and is frankly non-negotiable for heart health.
And I am here to argue that consensus is not the same as truth. My position is that the demonization of saturated fat is based on weak associational data from the 1950s that just entirely crumbles under modern scrutiny. Saturated fat has been unfairly targeted, and modern high-quality data shows it has virtually no effect on mortality.
All right, let's lay out our positions fully. I'll start. When you strip away the internet noise and look at the highest quality data, specifically randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, the evidence against saturated fat remains remarkably robust. I'm looking squarely at the Cochrane review from 2020. This wasn't some small, isolated study. This was a massive analysis of 15 trials with over 56,000 participants. And they found that reducing saturated fat intake led to a 17% reduction in combined cardiovascular events. That is not statistical noise. Furthermore, the American Heart Association's 2017 Presidential Advisory concluded that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated vegetable oil reduced cardiovascular disease by about 30%. Let me put that in perspective. That is a reduction similar to what you achieve by taking a statin medication. We also have a perfectly clear biological mechanism. Saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol drives atherosclerosis. It is a well-mapped pathology, and ignoring it means ignoring the most fundamental mechanics of heart disease.
Well, I hear the appeal of that narrative, but it's a house of cards. The diet-heart hypothesis was built on associational evidence from Ansel Keys in the 50s, which ignored countries that didn't fit his curve. When we look at modern massive data sets, the story flips completely. Take the PURE study, the prospective urban-rural epidemiology study. This looked at 135,000 subjects across 18 countries. It found that higher saturated fat intake was not associated with major cardiovascular disease, not associated with myocardial infarction, and not associated with cardiovascular mortality. In fact, it was associated with lower total mortality and a significantly lower risk of stroke. And regarding that Cochrane review you just cited, yes, you mentioned a drop in events, but you conveniently left out that the very same review found little or no effect of reducing saturated fat on all-cause mortality or cardiovascular mortality. People didn't live any longer. So, my position is that the strict guidelines capping saturated fat at under 10% of daily calories are entirely outdated and not supported by the totality of the evidence.
Okay, let's get straight into that, because we cannot talk about this without addressing the quality of the evidence. You're leaning heavily on PURE, which is an observational study. It is a massive survey, but the gold standard in science is the randomized control trial. The core trials from the 60s and 70s, like the Oslo Diet Heart Study, showed that when you replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat in a controlled setting, heart health definitively improves. You can't just wave that away with a survey where you're asking people to recall what they ate last year.
Observational studies absolutely have flaws, but the RCTs you're championing have massive skeletons in the closet. The Oslo study? That was a multi-intervention trial. They didn't just cut saturated fat, they cut sugar, they added fish, and they told people to stop smoking. You cannot isolate the fat reduction as the hero there. And if we're talking about core trials, we have to talk about the ones that were swept under the rug. Let's talk about the Minnesota coronary experiment and the Sydney heart study.
You mean the trials from over 50 years ago?
Yes, from the exact era that built the hypothesis. They are crucial because they were strict, institutionalized RCTs. In the Sydney heart study, they took men who had already had a heart attack and replaced their dietary saturated fat with safflower oil, which is a polyunsaturated fat, exactly what the AHA recommends today.
Right.
Died at a higher rate than the group eating the saturated fat. And the most shocking part is that this mortality data was essentially buried. It wasn't fully recovered, reanalyzed, and published until decades later.
Hold on. You cannot use the Sydney heart study as a bludgeon against current guidelines. The margarine they used in that specific study was absolutely loaded with trans fats. We didn't fully realize back then how exceptionally dangerous industrial trans fats were. Today, we know they are disastrous for cardiovascular health. So citing a study where people were inadvertently fed toxic trans fats to prove that vegetable oil is bad is frankly disingenuous.
Okay, that is the standard trans fat defense, and yes, it applies to Sydney. But it completely falls apart when you look at the Minnesota coronary experiment.
How so?
Because Minnesota used liquid corn oil, zero trans fats. It was a massive trial in state mental hospitals and nursing homes, highly controlled. And the result? They lowered cholesterol beautifully. But for every 30 milligram per deciliter drop in cholesterol, there was a 22% higher risk of death. The point here is that if the hypothesis were true, if lowering cholesterol by cutting saturated fat saves lives, we would see a mortality benefit in these massive, strictly controlled trials, and we simply do not. Reviews by D'Souza in 2015 and Siri Torino in 2010 confirm this. No significant association with cardiovascular mortality.
You're focusing exclusively on mortality, which is a classic revisionist tactic. You're dismissing non-fatal events as if they are trivial. A non-fatal heart attack is a life-altering catastrophe. It leads to heart failure, massive healthcare costs, disability, and a permanently diminished quality of life. If I can look a patient in the eye and say, if you follow this diet, you are significantly less likely to suffer a heart attack, that is a profound medical victory. We practice medicine to prevent suffering, not strictly to cheat death for an extra week.
But are we actually preventing suffering, or are we just trading one mechanism of disease for another? Let's pivot to the mechanism itself, because you brought up LDL earlier. You're treating LDL cholesterol like it's a single, monolithic bad guy, and it just isn't.
Lowering LDL is the primary proven target for CVD prevention worldwide.
But the LDL is everything view is wildly reductionist. We have to look at the subfractions. Dr. Ronald Cross and others have clearly shown that while saturated fat does raise LDL, it specifically raises the large, buoyant LDL particles.
Subfractions are biologically interesting, sure, but they don't change the clinical reality of an atherogenic burden.
They change the entire physical interaction with the artery. Think of LDL particles like vehicles on a highway. You have large, fluffy beach balls, and you have small, dense golf balls. Saturated fat increases the beach balls. They are buoyant, they don't easily penetrate the endothelium. What drives the small, dense golf balls, the ones that actually crash into the arterial wall, get stuck, oxidize, and form plaque? That is driven by triglycerides, insulin resistance, and refined carbohydrates.
That is a very convenient, very visual analogy, but it risks confusing the listener into thinking high cholesterol is safe. It isn't. While the particle size argument has merit in a petri dish or a specialized lab, when we look at actual patient outcomes, the correlation with total LDL holds. If you have enough beach balls clogging the highway, traffic still stops. The WHO and AHA guidelines link the biological evidence of LDL reduction directly with the lower incidence of CVD. You cannot simply wave away elevated ApoB or LDL because the particles are quote-unquote fluffy.
But traffic doesn't stop. If you raise the large LDL and you also raise HDL, the good cholesterol, which saturated fat consistently does, your overall risk profile often remains completely neutral. Sometimes it improves. The total cholesterol to HDL ratio is a far superior predictor of heart disease than LDL alone. And Pure showed this perfectly. Saturated fat raised LDL, but it also raised HDL and lowered triglycerides. That exact lipid response aligns perfectly with the fact that they saw lower total mortality.
I think relying on a ratio while your atherogenic particles are skyrocketing is playing with fire. But let's look at the replacement problem. This is where I think the anti-guideline movement completely loses the thread. You cannot talk about what happens when you remove saturated fat without talking about what you put back into the diet.
Sure, nutrition doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Exactly. The AHA guidelines are very specific. The health benefit comes from replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fats, polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats from plant sources, walnuts, flax, olive oil, canola oil. If you tell people saturated fat is fine, they hear I can eat whatever I want. And what did America do during the low-fat craze of the 90s? They replaced fat with refined carbohydrates, sugar, starches, Snackwell cookies.
Complete disaster. We agree on that.
Right. So if you replace butter with refined sugar, of course you get sicker. But that doesn't exonerate the butter. It just condemns the sugar. The trials show that when you replace the butter with polyunsaturated fats, cardiovascular events drop. That is the food matrix working correctly.
Okay, you brought up the food matrix, which is my favorite topic, because it actually proves my point. The guidelines treat the saturated fat in a wedge of Gouda cheese the exact same way they treat the saturated fat in a processed hot dog. But the human body treats them completely differently.
I agree the matrix matters, but it's not a free pass for limitless cheese.
It might be a free pass for dairy, honestly. Look at the research by Givens in 2022. In fermented dairy, cheese, yogurt, the fat globules are enclosed in a literal matrix of protein and calcium. This dramatically alters digestion. The calcium actually binds to the fatty acids in your gut, forming soaps that you excrete rather than absorb.
Meaning less of it hits the bloodstream.
Exactly. Plus, dairy contains specific fatty acids like C15.0 and C17.0 that are strongly associated with protective effects against heart disease. Yet, the AHA will put a heart-healthy checkmark on a box of highly processed sugary cereal and warn you to stay away from full-fat Greek yogurt. It's scientific malpractice. It completely ignores the complexity of real food.
Calling it malpractice is a massive overreach. The AHA is cautious because calories still matter. Cheese and butter are incredibly energy-dense. If we tell a population that is already suffering from an epidemic of obesity that cheese is protective, we open the floodgates. Obesity itself is a massive independent driver of heart disease. The guidelines are designed to protect the general population, not just a biohacker who meticulously tracks every macro.
But in trying to idiot-proof the advice, public health officials made it fundamentally wrong. We told people to fear the most nutrient-dense, satiating foods on the planet. Eggs, red meat, dairy, foods packed with choline, vitamins A, D, and K2. When you remove satiating natural fats, people get chronically hungry. And what do hungry people eat? The refined carbs you just mentioned. The low-fat guidelines inadvertently drove the obesity and insulin resistance epidemics.
I dispute the premise that the low-fat experiment actually happened. If you look at the food supply data, Americans never actually reduced their total fat intake. They just piled massive amounts of carbohydrates and extra calories on top of the fat they were already eating.
Because the fat they were eating was shifted to industrial seed oils. Which brings me back to your replacement argument. You want people to swap butter for canola oil or soybean oil? These are highly processed industrial oils, extracted with hexane solvents and high heat. They are loaded with omega-6 fatty acids, specifically linoleic acid, which is highly prone to oxidation. When those oxidized fats incorporate into your cell membranes, they drive systemic inflammation.
Okay, you are using buzzwords like toxic and industrial to scare people.
The term seed oil has become this trendy pejorative online. But scientifically, polyunsaturated fats are essential. They improve insulin sensitivity. The inflammation argument against omega-6s is largely theoretical and frankly not borne out in human outcome trials. When humans consume more PUFAs in place of saturated fat, their risk of heart disease goes down.
Only if you conflate omega-3s with omega-6s in those trials. When you isolate high omega-6 intake, the alleged benefits vanish.
That is heavily debated, but let's bring this down to a practical level for our listener. Let's talk about the number needed to treat, the NTT. We have decades of clinical trial data. The NTT for reducing saturated fat to prevent a cardiovascular event is about 56. That means 56 people need to appropriately restrict their saturated fat intake for a few years to prevent one major cardiovascular event.
I want everyone listening to let that sink in. 56 people have to eat a fundamentally restricted, bland, low-fat diet for years so that exactly one of them avoids a non-fatal event, and 0 of them live a day longer because of it. That is a terrible trade-off for public health.
In the realm of public health, an NNT of 56 is actually quite strong. Statins have an NNT in a very similar range for primary prevention. If we can prevent hundreds of thousands of heart attacks across an entire population, that is a massive success. It saves billions in healthcare and prevents untold personal suffering. The precautionary principle absolutely applies here. We have a mountain of mechanistic data linking LDL to plaque and clinical trials showing event reduction. Why would you gamble your heart health on a revisionist theory that says butter is back just because the all-cause mortality signal is a bit noisy?
Because it is not a gamble. It is an evolutionary logic issue. Humans have consumed saturated fats from animal sources for hundreds of thousands of years. The explosion of heart disease is a strictly modern phenomenon. It runs perfectly parallel to the rise of processed foods, refined sugars, and industrial seed oils. Blaming ancient ancestral foods for a modern disease just doesn't pass the basic sniff test. Furthermore, the Pure study showed that pushing saturated fat too low actually increases your risk of hemorrhagic stroke. We are risking brain bleeds to chase an outdated cholesterol target.
The ancestral argument is very appealing on a podcast, I'll admit. But our ancestors also generally died of infectious diseases at age 35 and didn't sit in ergonomic office chairs for 12 hours a day. Our modern context is sedentary, stressed, and hypercaloric. We simply cannot metabolize dense fats the way a prehistoric hunter-gatherer did. We have to adapt our intake to our current reality. And the reality is, when you lower atherogenic lipoproteins, you lower your risk of a heart attack.
We are going to spin on lipoproteins forever, I suspect. But I want to close my argument on the nature of the guideline process itself. The Dietary Guidelines Committee has historically been incredibly entrenched. They routinely block the consideration of external reviews that exonerate saturated fat. They ignore the nuances of a food matrix. It takes a very long time to turn a public health battleship, but this battleship is heading straight toward an iceberg of metabolic disease, and they refuse to look at the modern radar.
And hear me out, the committee reviewed the highest quality evidence and correctly discarded the low-quality observational noise that you're championing. Science is conservative by nature, and it should be. It demands absolutely extraordinary evidence to overturn a protective consensus that has held for 60 years.
And I firmly believe that extraordinary evidence is already here. We just need the institutional courage to acknowledge it.
So, looking at the clock, where does this leave our listener?
I think it leaves them with a profound but manageable choice. You can follow the established guidelines, eat your egg whites, cook with canola oil, and hope the LDL hypothesis holds up against the test of time. Or you can look at the newer data, eat real, whole foods, meat, full-fat dairy, vegetables, avoid the ultra-processed junk, and trust that your body knows exactly how to handle natural fats.
And my closing advice is to simply look at the clinical scoreboard. The interventions that lower saturated fat and replace it with unsaturated plant fats have a proven winning track record in controlled trials for reducing actual heart attacks. That is the safest, most data-backed bet we have. We should not throw out the precautionary principle just because we collectively want permission to eat more bacon.
It's really not about permission.
It's about optimizing proper, satiating nutrition. But I suspect we won't solve a 60-year war in 20 minutes today.
No, we won't. But we can certainly illuminate the battlefield for everyone listening.
That we can.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It was a pleasure as always.
We hope this debate helps you navigate the incredibly complex world of nutrition with a much more critical eye. Join us next time on The Debate.